So the first example I want to give you is one I call the Green Box, which is an organisation I was working with, which was a customer claims processing centre. Customer claims typically came in on paperwork into the mailroom, and then as they went through the building, through different teams to be scanned, registered on the system, eventually a claim was assessed, processed, customer was informed. That process actually lasted, on average, 120 days. An incredible length of time with all sorts of different twists and turns in the process, all sorts of different issues and problems. So you can imagine the customer at the other end of the process was still waiting for this result, and in many cases was very much dependent on that determination. As I was walking around the building, following the paperwork to try and get a view for how it was actually working, we came to the very end of the process, in the mailroom, and the lady who was taking me around said, right, and that's it, we then send the letters. So I just saw underneath the counter a green box, and it was absolutely full of letters. So I said, well, what are those for? You know, why are they there? She said, well, that's our commitment to quality. Just in case anybody thinks they've made a mistake on any of these processes, every time a letter's ready, we put it in the green box for 7 days, so they've got a week to pull it before it actually gets posted out. So I started to think about the impact for the poor customer, some of whom were actually being evicted, and the organisation had to set up a helpline to help those being evicted because the paperwork was delayed, and of course many of these letters were sat in this green box. So talking to them about what actually customers value, and getting them to think through how their service was designed, and to make sure that the service was going to be improved for the customer. So one of the techniques that we'd recommend is called the Carlo model, which starts to look at the different way service is delivered, the different features, and how different customers would respond to it. There are a number of different categories here. You've got what are called the must-be features, the features that clients take for granted. If they're not there, it's a problem. And you can eventually say, you know, if it's not there, they're dissatisfied, but the best you can be is that the service is okay. You can't be any better than that with some of those features. Similarly, you've got another category called the more is better category, where if they're there, that's great, but the more that there are, the better it can be. So it could be the speed to address an issue. I've made insurance claims over the years, some of which have taken 5, 6, 7 weeks to address, one of which was actually done in about half an hour while I was on the telephone. So the faster that claim process is, the more impressed and the more satisfied the customer's going to be. And then of course you've got the delighters, which if they're there at all, it's great, but again, the more that there are, the better. You might say it's you know, flowers in a newly rented house. There could be any example in any of the different businesses that you've got, but something that causes the customer to step back and think, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And by looking at those 3 different dimensions, you can then start to design and improve the service so that your customers will find it better and better to do business with you, talk about you more and more to their colleagues, and become more of a reference for you. You can sometimes also use an extra category called the reversal, where if something happens, then that's actually a major problem and it shouldn't be there at all, but it's often designed into many processes. And with customer feedback, and that feedback is usually free, you can start to iron those out. And that works very well with CRM systems, so you can actually segment your customers and understand who requires different things, who appreciates different elements of that service. So the second example is what I call the rubber band, which is it's a shared service operation, and it was all to do with processing customer payments. And there were many thousands of checks, around about 25,000 checks that used to come in the mail every morning. And they used to work their way through a business process, you know, through the sort of the scanning and sorting, through the mail opening, and onto the remittance processing. Now, halfway through that process, there was a guy who was facing a wall on a desk, and his job was to take all of the checks which came out of the mail opening process, count them into batches of 200, write out a batch header, put it underneath the checks and put a rubber band around them, log it all in the Excel spreadsheet to provide an audit trail, put them in a green box, and then the porter came and moved it along to the next stage of the process. He had absolutely no idea that the very next person who handled those checks took the rubber band off, threw the header in the bin, and put the checks on a great big pile to go through the next machine. So his entire job, his entire working life, was a complete waste of time. Unfortunately. So you can imagine when we started to look at the end-to-end process and the flow of this paperwork and what people actually did, the decisions they made, the activities they went, people stood back and thought, why on earth do we do it like this? As it happened, we then managed to move him across and he joined another team where there was a bottleneck, so the overall throughput of the process was faster, and of course we didn't actually do any of that wasted activity. But I'm sure there are many rubber bands in most organisations somewhere. Unless there's a systematic way of looking at the way the work flows through the organisation, or even as the customers engage with the organisation at different points, if that's not done regularly and systematically, there will be disconnects like that no one's recognised yet. So one of the techniques to address that is called a value stream map, which literally on one sheet of paper starts to look at how that flows through. It also looks at productivity, it looks at throughput, it looks at timings, and it makes sure that everybody understands what they do and how it relates to the next person in the chain, and how ultimately it relates to giving the customer service. And that is one great starting point for making that simpler, making it quicker, and improving that whole process. Third example is where the spaghetti diagram. This was actually the same process as the check process I mentioned a minute ago. And what we found was when we started to look at the way that the checks flowed around the building, they were quite tortuous. You can see that's a map of the building there. The red line is where they came in through the back door. They routed themselves through all sorts of different teams with piles of paperwork, backlogs at every stage, with people physically moving green boxes around to the different workstations. It was very difficult to keep track of it. It was very difficult to see the performance overall through the course of the day. There was a lot of wasted effort and delay, and certainly the first checks got processed something like 7 or 8 hours before the last ones. But they were all work in progress, and they were all subject to management, measurement, and audit checks at certain points. So the approach there was simply to straighten that out, to smooth the process flow, make sure that those people who are working with those the different process steps could either be combined to simplify them, they could be put next to each other physically, so as soon as one person had finished they could be handed on to the next person, and then all of the different numerous causes of issues and problems could simply be ironed out by people talking to each other in a way that it wasn't possible when they were spread across the site. So very simple techniques, and again one of the starting points for continuous improvement as people talk to each other about the problems they're perceiving, and they can very, very quickly sort them out. Fourth example is a remittance processor, which was a piece of technology which processes paper, something like 4 or 5 different sheets per second. It zips through, the paper's all held up in a hopper, it zips through at a rapid rate, it's automatically read by computer, and the data is stored in the database. So I was impressed by this machine as I was looking at it, and I was talking to the operator, and he was saying, yep, this is absolutely fantastic, it's twice as fast as the previous machine. So I said, well, that's brilliant. So when all the paperwork goes through at that speed, what happens then? He said, oh, well, we put it in a pile and it waits there till 4 o'clock. So I'm thinking, why did they invest in this machine if all it did was create another bottleneck somewhere else? And the use of technology to actually make a difference to the customer is obviously a starting point for choosing how to improve processes, how to adopt that technology. Did that machine actually make any difference to the speed the customer got the paperwork at the end of it, or the way the information got to the final step of the process? No, it didn't. And in fact, it was worse than that, because in the mail opening section, they had been given a target. And they'd been given a target to open all their mail by 11 o'clock in the morning, even though the Royal Mail didn't actually pick up the paperwork at the very end of the day until about 5 o'clock. So they used to rush their work in order to hit their targets, which meant that sometimes they didn't have a chance to check it properly, and there were staples left in the paper. When the paperwork got to the remittance processor, of course, it got into the hopper, into the machine, and jammed it. And they had to then start taking the lid off, taking all the paper out, unjamming it, resorting it, getting it back into the hopper, working out what went onto the computer and what didn't, and then starting again. So what we did with that guy with the rubber band is we put him back into the mail opening team. That removed some of the bottleneck. We also slowed their work down so that they could actually do a better job. They could make sure that the staples weren't in there. And the key there to improving the productivity was not asking them to speed up their work, but asking them to slow down their work and making sure that the process was synchronized through the whole operation.